There's no question that they could not have consolidated their revolution without the capitalists.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. They had too many enemies. Not only outside enemies, the White Russians. The Ukrainians themselves were not particularly happy. All your ethnic groups in Russia were not particularly happy with the Bolsheviks. They could not have won without Western assistance. There is no question about that. Then they were starving. The factory, they couldn't operate the factories because the Bolsheviks shot all the managers and the technicians. Either that or they left Russia. The factories were closed down. Russia was starving. By 1922, Lenin himself said the end has come. They had no food. They had these closed down plants. The plants were not destroyed in the revolution. That's what the textbooks will tell you, including Kennan, the State Department expert. He says the Russian factories were destroyed in the revolution. They were not destroyed. Why? Because I've seen the photographs after the revolution, and they're right in the Hoover Institution Tower. There are these massive boxes of photographs of Russian industry after the revolution. They could not operate the plants. So what do we do with Averell Harriman and the Chase Bank and National Bank and our old friends on Wall Street? They go in there, and of course the Hoover mission to feed Russia. We go in there and we have these 250, 300 concessions in which American companies went into Russia, and they started up the idle plants. Averell Harriman took the manganese concessions, Armand Hammer, Occidental Petroleum took the pencil factories and the asbestos plants. And all these top capitalists went in and they got Russia going on behalf of the Bolsheviks, because the Bolsheviks either shot or kicked out all the people who could run, all the Russians who could run the plants. Another point, the Tsarist industry was at a very high level. Your textbooks will tell you that Tsarist industry was backward. It wasn't until the Soviets came along that it began to make progress. This is absolute nonsense. The Soviets, the Russians in 1913 had 2 indigenous Russian vehicles, Russian automobiles. There has never been an indigenous Soviet automobile. They've all come from the West. The Tsarist Russians produced an airplane in 1916 with a wingspan longer than the 747. This is not known today. It's just wiped out history. Technologically, the Tsarist Russians were at least on a par with the rest of the world. They only began to decline when the Soviets took over. And then you've got the long history from that point onwards, how we got the first 5-year plan, 1929, 1933. I look at the first 5-year plan, I look at every plant that was built in Russia at that time. Every single plant was built by a Western company. Not one single plant was built by the Soviets. You name any plant, if there are any Russians here from way back, you name any plant in the first 5-year plan, and you know as well as I do who built it. It wasn't the Soviets, it was a Western company. And you run down the list, Caterpillar tractor. There are more Caterpillar tractors in the Soviet Union than there are outside the Soviet Union. Ford Model A, Ford built the Gorky plant. And as soon as the Ford engineers left, they started to turn out military vehicles. You name it, in the first 5-year plan, every single plant was built basically by American companies, but a lot of British, French, and German and Japanese were in there too. Then the second 5-year plan in the 1930s was a duplicate. They tried to copy the first 5-year plan with their own resources. They fell flat on their faces, and they had to come back to the Western companies for assistance to duplicate the plants put in the first 5-year plan. And for example, I was in Douglas Aircraft Company. They let me into their files, and it was amazing the detailed assistance given by Douglas Aircraft. They bought one DC-3, and then they bought a DC-3 in sub-assembly and all kinds of duplicate spare parts to get the thing going. And then we've got that story, I don't know how much detail you want, which continues right up to today, July 1, 1987, and you mentioned, I think, this morning, the Toshiba and the Toshiba Japanese plant and the Norwegian company, a government-owned plant, which provided the milling machines which enabled now the Soviet submarines to be 10 times quieter than they were before, and that's going to cost us $4 billion so that we can offset what we have given them. And this stupidity has continued stupidity in my sense. From the viewpoint of a Wall Street capitalist, I guess it's smart business. This has continued for 60 years.
And this supposedly by our allies, but this is not the people of Japan and Norway.
No.
This is again the internationalists.
It's the internationalists. Toshiba represented on the Trilateral Commission founded by David Rockefeller in 1973. It's your top corporate elitists, your top corporate establishment attorneys, the top politicians. Senator Mansfield once said, you don't get along unless you go along.